She was not a gift. She was not a prize. She was not something her father had the right to give away, but he did it anyway. On the coldest night of the year, without even looking her in the eyes. Her name was Vorra, and she had known from the moment she could walk that her father saw her as something useful, something tradable, something that could be handed over when the time came and the price was right. She had been raised in the heart of the ancient wolflands, where the trees grew so tall they seemed to touch the belly of the sky, and where the earth itself was soaked with the blood of centuries of war and sacrifice. She had been taught to carry herself quietly. She had been taught to speak only when spoken to. She had been taught that a woman's greatest power was her silence. But Vorra had never truly believed that. Not once. Not even when she tried. Her father, the wolf chieftain Halvus, had ruled their pack with an iron fist wrapped in fur. His word was law, and his decisions were never questioned. Not by the elders, not by the warriors, and certainly not by his only daughter. He had raised her alone after her mother passed into the spirit winds when Vorra was barely 4 seasons old, and the tenderness that might have softened him had gone with her mother, buried deep beneath the frost. So when the Dragon Emperor's messengers arrived at the edge of their territory, draped in robes the colour of midnight and carrying scrolls sealed with the black wax of the Emperor's mark, Halvus did not hesitate. He did not consult the elders. He did not light the fire of council or call the pack to circle. He simply nodded, unrolled the scroll, and agreed. His daughter would go to the Dragon Emperor. She would bear him an heir, and in return the Wolflands would be left in peace. Halvus thought he was being clever. He thought he was protecting his people. He thought he was making the kind of hard, cold decision that great leaders make when the world gives them no other choice. He did not think about what his daughter might do once she arrived in that palace. He did not think about what she might become. He did not think about the fire that had always burned behind her quiet eyes, steady and patient, waiting for the right moment to rise. He should have, because Vorra did not go to that palace to be a vessel. She did not go to kneel. She did not go to disappear quietly into the Emperor's chambers and spend her days producing heirs and fading into the stone walls. She went to survive. And surviving for a woman like Vorra had always looked a great deal like winning. So, before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below, whether you are watching from in any part of the world. Let us know you are here. Let us know you are watching, because this story, this particular fire, was made for people who refuse to stay quiet. Now, let's begin. The night her father made his decision, the wolves were restless. Vorra had noticed it first, the way the younger ones paced the outer ring of the settlement, their paws pressing deep into the cold earth, their heads low and their ears flat against their skulls. The elders among the pack had gone quiet in that particular way that meant something heavy was coming, something that could not be stopped, only endured. Even the wind had changed direction, pulling away from the north and curling inward like it wanted to listen. Vorra had been sitting near the fire grinding dried herbs between 2 smooth stones, when her father's chief warrior, a thick-necked man named Brudok, had come to tell her to wash her face and put on her good wrap. She had looked up at him slowly, reading his expression the way she had always read the forest, carefully, without rushing, watching for what lay beneath the surface. His eyes had not met hers, and that had told her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken between them. She had washed her face. She had put on her good wrap, the one edged with the dark brown fur her mother had stitched along the hem before she died. She had stood straight and walked to her father's lodge without being asked a second time, because Vorra had learned long ago that walking toward difficult things on her own terms felt different from being dragged toward them. It felt like choosing. And even the smallest choice, when everything else was being taken from you, mattered. The inside of Halvis's lodge was thick with smoke and silence. The two messengers from the Dragon Emperor stood near the far wall, their faces covered except for their eyes, their hands folded inside their wide sleeves like they were hiding something delicate or dangerous. 3 elders sat along the left wall, their eyes low, their mouths pressed into tight lines. Nobody looked at Vorra when she entered. To nobody moved. Her father stood at the centre of the room, and he was the only one who turned to face her, though he could not quite hold her gaze for long. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders with deep-set eyes the colour of old bark, and a jaw that had never once trembled in all the years she had known him. He had survived battles. He had led hunts in blizzards. He had stood between their pack and ruin more times than the elders could count. And yet, in that moment, with his daughter standing before him in the firelight, he had looked, for just a breath, almost sorry. Almost. He had told her plainly. He had told her in his usual way, which meant without softness and without apology, the way a man describes the weather or the quality of a harvest. The Dragon Emperor, Kyle Dravos, ruler of the ancient emberlands and master of the great shifting throne, had requested a mate from among the wolf tribes. He had requested a woman of pure lineage, strong in body, clear in mind, and capable of producing an heir who would carry the blood of both wolf and dragon. He had made the request through his messengers with a tone that left very little room for the word no. Halvis had said yes, and Vorra, his only daughter, of the blood of the great Halvis line, would be the one to go. Vorra stood very still while he spoke. She had kept her face the way she had always kept it in front of him, smooth, unreadable, not unlike the surface of a frozen lake that gave nothing away about what moved beneath it. She had not cried. She had not argued. She had not reached for the hunting blade she kept tucked inside her wrap, which would have been a dramatic and ultimately useless gesture, but which a smaller, more frightened part of her had considered for exactly one breath. When he finished speaking, she had asked one question, just one, and she had asked it quietly, the way she always did when the question mattered most. "Did you tell them what I carry, Father?" Halvis had gone very still. The messengers had not moved. The elders had stared at the ground like it suddenly held great interest for them. Because Vorra was not simply the chieftain's daughter. She was not simply a woman of good lineage and strong body. She was the last woman of the Halvis line to have been born under the double moon, the night when both moons hung full and low in the sky together, an event that came once in a generation and which, among the wolf peoples, carried a meaning that was both ancient and exact. A woman born under the double moon did not simply shift. She ruled the shift. She could call the wolf form forward or pull it back not only in herself but in others, if she was strong enough, if she had trained long enough, if she had learned how to use what lived inside her without flinching from it. Halvis had not told the Dragon Emperor's messengers this particular detail. He had cleared his throat. He had looked away. And in the silence that followed, Vorra had understood the full shape of what was happening. She was being sent, not as a partner, not as an equal, not even truly, as a mate. She was being sent as a solution, a way to smooth over the long and dangerous tension between the wolf territories and the Dragon Emperor's expanding reach. A warm body with good blood and a quiet enough manner to make the trade feel reasonable. Her father had priced her exactly as high as she needed to be to buy peace, and exactly low enough that the Emperor would not ask too many questions before agreeing. She nodded once. She had turned, and she had walked out of the lodge, and she had gone back to her fire, and she had sat back down, and she had resumed grinding the dried herbs between the two smooth stones, her hands steady and her face still, and while the rest of the pack waited in the shadows to see what she would do. She had done nothing. Not yet. That night, after the fire burned low and the settlement grew quiet, Vorra had gone to the edge of the tree line alone. She had pressed her bare feet into the cold earth and let the wolf rise in her slowly, the way she always did when she needed to think clearly. The shift came like breathing. It always had for her, easy and deep and total. And when she stood on 4 paws in the dark, like her senses opened up the way a window opens in a sealed room, flooding her with everything the night held. She could smell the messengers. Even from this distance, they smelled like ash and something older, something that lived in deep stone and carried heat the way embers carry heat, from within, slowly, for a long time. She could smell her father's guilt, which was real and present and sour, the way old iron smells in rain. She could smell the fear of the younger wolves who still paced the outer ring, though they did not know exactly what they feared, only that something large had shifted in the world they knew. And she could smell something else, faint and far away, and carried on the wind from the direction the messengers had come from. Something cold and sharp and enormous, like the inside of a mountain, like the breath of something that had lived so long it had grown past the need for warmth. That was the Dragon Emperor. That was Kael Dravos. That was where she was going. She stood in the dark for a long time, breathing it in, letting herself feel the full weight of it without running from it or shrinking under it. And when she finally let the wolf recede and stood again on 2 feet in the cold, she made herself a promise. The kind of promise that does not need words because it lives in the bones rather than the mouth. She would go. She would go quietly, without struggle, without causing her father shame or giving the messengers reason to report that the wolf girl had been difficult. She would go and she would arrive and she would look at everything around her very carefully, the way she had always looked at things, the way her mother had taught her to look at a forest she did not know, not with fear, not with arrogance, but with open, patient attention. And then she would find the thing that nobody had thought to guard, because in every palace, no matter how large, no matter how ancient, no matter how powerful the one who sat at its centre, there was always something that had been left unguarded, always a door that had been forgotten, always a thread that, if you pulled it with enough patience and exactly the right amount of pressure, would cause something enormous to unravel. Her father had given her to the Dragon Emperor to bear an heir. He had done it without asking her. He had done it without warning her. He had done it without truly seeing her, the way he had never truly seen her, not since her mother died, and he had started looking at his daughter and seeing only what she could be used for. He did not know her. That had always been his greatest mistake, and it was going to become, in ways he could not yet imagine, his most consequential one, because Vorra was going to that palace, She was going to walk through those great stone gates and bow her head at exactly the right moments and say exactly the right things and be exactly patient enough and exactly quiet enough that nobody would feel the need to watch her too closely. And then, when the time was right, and when she had learned everything she needed to learn, she was going to take that throne. Not for revenge, not out of anger, though the anger was real, and she did not pretend otherwise. She was going to take it because she was the only one capable of holding it in the way it needed to be held, with a hand that understood both wolf and fire, both old blood and older stone, both the hunger of a people who had been overlooked and the danger of a power that had grown too comfortable. The wind shifted again. The double moon was long past, but its mark was still in her bones, steady and warm and patient as a coal that has been buried in ash all winter, waiting for the first breath of spring to bring it roaring back to life. She walked back to the settlement. She lay down beside the low fire. She closed her eyes. In 3 days she would leave. And nothing, not her father, not an emperor, not a throne made of stone and fire and centuries of dominion, would be the same by the time she was finished. The journey to the Dragon Emperor's palace took 11 days on foot and by river, through territories that grew stranger and heavier with each passing dawn. Vorra travelled with the 2 messengers and a small escort of 4 stone-faced guards who wore the emperor's black sash across their chests and spoke to each other in a low, clipped dialect she did not yet know, though she listened to every word and stored each sound carefully in the back of her mind. The way a person stores dry wood before a long winter, patient, methodical, and never wasting a single piece. She had been given a horse, a lean dark animal with nervous eyes that kept sliding toward her in a way that told her the horse could sense what she carried beneath her skin. She rode it gently, speaking to it in the old wolf tongue when the others were not close enough to hear. Low sounds that settled the animal's breathing, and gradually, over the course of the first 2 days, Vorra brought its ears forward and its steps even. By the 3rd day, the horse moved with her the way a well-matched partner moves, attuned and trusting and no longer afraid. She noted this. It would not be the last time she would need to steady something frightened and make it useful. The land changed as they moved deeper into the Ember territories. The great dark forests of the Wolflands gave way first to open plains where the grass grew pale and silver and rustled in a wind that smelled of deep earth and old heat. Then the plains gave way to hills of dark red stone, layered and cracked like the skin of something ancient and enormous that had once lived and burned and settled into stillness over uncountable years. There were no trees here, only low, tough plants that grew in the crevices of the rock and put out small, hard flowers the colour of dried blood. Vorra watched it all without expression, but she felt it, the weight of the land, the way it pushed back against her senses the further she travelled from her own territory. The wolf in her did not like it here. The smells were wrong. Too much heat and stone and not enough living green, not enough rain-soaked bark or deep root earth. She kept the wolf quiet, through will alone, breathing through it the way she had learned to breathe through cold water, to steadily, without panic, letting the discomfort exist without letting it win. On the 7th night, they camped on a flat stretch of red rock, and one of the messengers, the shorter of the 2, whose name she had learned was Serovan, sat across the fire from her and studied her face with an expression that was more curious than cold. He said to her, in the common tongue they shared, that most of the women who made this journey wept by the 2nd day and were inconsolable by the 5th. He said it not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone reporting a known and predictable fact. Vorra looked at him across the fire and said, evenly and without particular emphasis, that she had never found weeping useful on a journey where she still had many days left to travel. Sir Reuven had been quiet for a moment, and then he had made a small sound that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. He had looked back at the fire and said nothing else. But she had caught the way his shoulders had settled slightly, the way a man's shoulders settle when he has revised an opinion he did not realize he was holding. Good. She was already learning who could be read and how. On the 11th day they crested a wide ridge of black stone, and Vorra saw the palace for the first time. It rose from the base of a great mountain like it had grown there, like the mountain itself had decided to become a building. Layer upon layer of dark stone and arched gates and towers that leaned slightly inward at the top, as if they were bowing towards something at the palace's centre. Smoke rose from a dozen points along the walls, not the smoke of hearth fires or cooking, but the deep, steady smoke of something that burned continuously and had burned continuously for so long that the stone walls nearest to it had gone permanently black and smooth, polished by centuries of heat. The gates were immense. They were made of a stone so dark it was almost without colour, and they were carved from top to base with figures that she could not read clearly from this distance, but which moved, even in carved stone, with the unmistakable coiled energy of something powerful and barely contained. Above the gate, cut deep into the lintel stone, were 3 words in the old imperial script, and though she could not read the full dialect, she recognized the root word for dominion in the centre. Flanked on both sides by words that she would later learn meant permanent and absolute. Permanent and absolute dominion. She looked at those words for a long moment, sitting straight on her dark horse with the wind pressing her wrap against her body, and the wolf landed a full 11 days behind her. She looked at those words and she felt something shift quietly inside her. Not fear, not awe, but a kind of settling. The same settling she felt when she finally understood the full shape of a thing she had been circling for a long time. Now she knew what she was dealing with. Now she could begin. They rode through the outer gates and into a wide courtyard where servants moved quickly and silently along the edges, their eyes on the ground, their steps precise and contained, like people who had learned through long experience exactly how much space they were permitted to occupy. The courtyard smelled of ash and hot metal, and something beneath both of those, something older and darker like the breath of the deep mountain itself, exhaling slowly up through the stone. Vorra was taken from her horse by a woman who introduced herself as Lena, the head attendant of the Emperor's household. Lena was small and swift and precise, with sharp eyes that assessed Vorra from crown to foot in one smooth pass. And whatever she found in that assessment caused only the briefest flicker across her face before it went neutral again. Lena told her, walking quickly through a corridor of black-veined stone, that she would be given rooms in the east wing, near the garden wall. She told her that she would be presented to the Emperor Kyle Dravos at the evening meal 2 days hence, and that in those 2 days she was expected to rest, eat well, and allow the palace seamstresses to fit her with appropriate clothing. She told her the rules of address, the rules of movement within the palace, the rules about which corridors she was permitted to walk and which ones she was not. She told her all of this without pausing and without asking if Vorra had questions. Vorra listened. She memorized everything. And when Lena finally stopped walking and opened a door into a set of rooms that were larger and warmer than anything she had slept in before, Vorra thanked her simply and stepped inside. The rooms were draped in deep red and brown, heavy fabrics that held heat, the way the Wolf Lodge held heat, through mass and closeness. And there was a window cut into the outer wall that looked over a narrow garden where low, dark plants grew in careful rows between stones. Beyond the garden wall was the mountain itself, close enough that she could hear very faintly the deep and rhythmic sound that came from somewhere inside it. A pulse almost, steady and low, like a heartbeat made of stone and fire. She stood at the window for a long time, listening to it, letting her senses unfold carefully and quietly, cataloguing everything they brought back to her. She could smell 17 distinct things in the air of this wing of the palace, and she spent time with each one, separating and naming them, building the invisible map of this place, the way she built every map, from the inside out. She could smell power here. Not the power of a single man, but the power of a system, of centuries of control layered over each other, like the geological layers of the red stone hills she had crossed to get here, each one compressing the ones beneath it, each one adding weight and permanence to the whole. But she could also smell something else. Faint and interesting and threaded through the deeper smells like a vein of different minerals running through otherwise uniform stone. She could smell instability, not the brittle instability of something about to crack, but the slow, underground instability of something that had been bearing too much weight for too long and had begun, very quietly, very deeply, to shift. She did not smile. She was not in the habit of smiling when nobody was watching. It seemed like a waste of energy. But something in her went warm and attentive, the way a hunting wolf goes warm and attentive when the wind brings it exactly the scent it has been patient enough to wait for. 2 days. She had 2 days before she met the Dragon Emperor. 2 days to rest, to eat, to let the seamstresses measure her and wrap her in the Emperor's chosen fabrics, to play the part of the quiet, cooperative wolf girl who had come obediently at her father's word and was grateful for the honor being given to her. She could do that. She had been doing that in one form or another her entire life. She was very good at it. But she was going to use every hour of those 2 days and every hour of every day that came after to learn this place down to its deepest foundation. She was going to learn the names and the loyalties and the fears of every person within these walls who mattered. She was going to learn the pulse of the mountain and the structure of the Emperor's power and the exact location of every door, every weak wall, every unguarded thread. And she was going to do it so quietly and so steadily that by the time anyone thought to look at her as something other than a wolf girl sent to bear an heir, she would already be holding far more of this palace in her hands than any of them had thought possible to give. Her father had sold her to buy peace. The Dragon Emperor had sent for her to produce a bloodline. Neither of them had asked her what she intended. Neither of them had thought to wonder whether the quiet, still-faced woman arriving at the gate of absolute and permanent dominion might have plans of her own. That was their mistake. And mistakes, in Vorra's experience, did not stay small forever. They grew. Slowly, yes, but with absolute certainty, the way a root grows through stone, patient and inevitable, or until the day the stone simply opens. She turned from the window. She sat on the low bed. She breathed slowly and let the wolf settle into the same patient quiet she carried in her own chest, steady and warm and entirely, completely awake. She was here. She had arrived, and it had already begun. The evening of the presentation came with a stillness that Vorra recognized from the wolflands, the stillness that fell over a forest just before something large moved through it. She had spent the 2 days doing exactly what she intended. She had rested in the morning, genuinely, because rest was a tool and she was not foolish enough to exhaust herself before the most important moment of her arrival. She had eaten the food brought to her, rich and unfamiliar, were heavy with spices she did not know, and she had noted each flavor and texture the way she noted everything, as information, as data, as pieces of a picture she was building carefully. She had allowed the seamstresses to dress her in the palace's deep crimson fabrics, heavy and draped and formal, and she had stood still and said little while they worked around her, listening to the small things they said to each other. The brief, careful words that servants exchange when they think no one important is listening. She had learned, in those 2 days, that the Emperor Heir Dravos had not taken a meal with anyone in 11 months. She had learned that 2 of the High Council's eldest members had been replaced in the last 2 seasons, and that the replacements were younger men who had come up through the Emperor's personal guard, loyal in the way that men are loyal when their loyalty has been purchased rather than earned. When she had learned that the mountain's deep pulse had grown louder in recent years, and that this made the palace servants uneasy in a way they could not name but could not entirely hide. She had learned that the Emperor himself was not old. He was not the ancient, cold-eyed ruler she had constructed in her mind on the journey here. He was, by the count, the seamstresses let slip in a moment of unguarded murmuring, only in his 32nd year. He had taken the throne at 20, after his father died in the great fire collapse of the mountain's lower chamber, an event that had killed 9 people and which the official account described as an accident, though the way Lena's jaw tightened the single time it was mentioned, told Vorra that the official account was not the only one. She filed all of this carefully. And then she dressed, and she walked, accompanied by Lena and 2 guards, through the long corridor toward the Great Hall. And the Great Hall of Heir Dravos was enormous in the way that things are enormous when they have been built not for comfort but for effect, wide enough that the far wall felt distant, high enough that the ceiling was lost in shadow above the reach of the torches. The floor was black stone, polished to a mirror finish, and the walls were hung with the skins and banners of every people the Emperor's line had conquered or absorbed or simply outlasted over the generations. A history written in trophy and ruin, stretching back further than Vorra could count. There were perhaps 40 people in the hall, standing in loose groupings along the walls, and they all turned to look at her when she entered, with the precise, calibrated attention of people who had learned to track whatever the Emperor tracked, in case it mattered. Vorra walked to the center of the room at a measured pace, neither rushing nor dragging, and she kept her eyes forward and her spine straight and her face arranged in an expression that was respectful and composed without being submissive, a distinction she had practiced carefully in the polished bronze of her room's reflecting surface, because the difference between those 2 things was real and important, and she intended every person in this room to feel it without being able to articulate exactly why. Kyle Dravos was already seated at the head of the long stone table when she arrived, and she looked at him directly, because looking away would have been a mistake, and looking down would have been a larger one. He was not what she had expected. He was tall, even seated, with the long, spare build of someone who had grown up moving quickly and had never entirely lost the habit, broad through the shoulders but not thick, yet with the kind of controlled stillness in his body that she recognized immediately, and with a particular kind of attention, because it was the same stillness she had taught herself. It was the stillness of someone who had learned that giving nothing away was its own form of power. His eyes were the colour of deep amber, almost orange in the torchlight, and they were fixed on her with an expression that she found interesting, because it was not the expression she had prepared herself for. When she had prepared herself for cold assessment, for the measuring look of a man appraising something he had ordered and checking whether the delivery was satisfactory. She had prepared herself for dismissal, for the half-attentive glance of a man who had already categorized her and moved on. She had not prepared herself for genuine, careful attention, for the look of a man who was actually trying to read her and finding the task more difficult than he had anticipated. Good. That was very good, he said to her, in a voice that was low and even and carried the hall without effort, that she was welcome in his palace, and that he hoped the journey had not been too difficult. He said it formally, the words of protocol that were expected at such a meeting, but he said them while continuing to look at her face in a way that made it clear he was not particularly interested in the protocol and was paying much closer attention to what she would do with it. She inclined her head exactly the right amount, and she said, in the common tongue, that the journey had been long but the land had been worth seeing, and that she was grateful for the welcome. She said it simply and clearly, without ornament, and she watched his eyes shift very slightly in a way that told her he had noticed the absence of ornament and found it worth noting. They ate. The meal was long and formal, with much movement of dishes and much low conversation among the assembled court. And Vorra sat near the emperor's end of the table and spoke when addressed, and listened always, turning the sounds and words and silences of this room over in her mind with the same quiet focus she gave to everything. She noticed that the people around her were careful, not careful in the way that people are careful around a ruler they respect, but careful in the closer, tighter way that people are careful around something that might turn on them without warning. She noticed the way eyes moved toward Kyle Dravos and then quickly away, the way conversations near him stayed shallow and smooth, never touching the surface of anything real. She noticed that he ate little and spoke sparingly, and that his attention moved around the room in long, slow sweeps, unhurried and thorough, the way a predator surveys a territory it knows well and is watching for small changes. He was not comfortable here. She realized it gradually and with some surprise. He was not a man sitting at ease in his own great hall. He was a man holding something in place through the force of sustained effort, the way you hold a river in its banks through the strength of the walls you have built around it, and she could sense, with the wolf-born perception that lived below her ordinary sight, that the effort was older than it should have been and heavier than it looked. Toward the end of the meal, when the hall had loosened slightly with warmth and wine, and he spoke to her again, quietly so that only she could hear. He asked her if the wolf-lands were as cold as the old songs described. He asked it with something in his voice that she had not expected to hear from a dragon emperor, something that was almost, though carefully contained, wistful. She looked at him for a moment before answering, and she said yes, that they were cold, but that cold had never troubled her because she had always known how to carry her own heat. He looked at her, and something shifted in his amber eyes, something that had no name she could put to it yet, but that she stored carefully alongside everything else she was collecting in this place, because it was interesting, and because interesting things, in her experience, always turned out to matter. After the meal, she was escorted back to her rooms by Lena, who walked beside her in silence for most of the way before saying, almost to herself, that Vorra had done well. Nelen said it with the clipped precision of a woman who did not give out assessments lightly, and Vorra thanked her quietly and meant it. Inside her room she stood again at the window. The mountain pulse was low and steady below everything, and the garden was dark, and the sky above the palace walls was thick with stars that looked different here than they did over the wolflands. Closer, maybe, or just unfamiliar enough to feel that way. She thought about his eyes. She thought about the careful stillness of his body and the weight she had sensed beneath it, and the wistfulness in his voice when he asked about the cold. She thought about the servants' unease and the replaced council members, and the official account of his father's death that made Len's jaw go tight. She thought about the thread, the unguarded one, the one that, pulled at the right moment with the right pressure, would cause something enormous to unravel. She was beginning to see its shape. She was beginning to feel where it lay, and how it ran and what it was attached to. It was not where she had expected to find it. It was not in the stone walls or the court politics or the mountains' slow and ancient instability. It was closer than that. It was more personal than that. It was in the man himself, in the thing he was carrying that nobody in that hall had ever been trusted enough to know about. In the loneliness of a ruler who had held everything at arm's length for so long, he had started to forget what it felt like to be held in return. Vorra breathed slowly. She did not rush toward this understanding or try to grasp it before it was fully formed. She let it settle, the way she let everything settle, with patience and with absolute unsentimental clarity. She was going to take this throne. That had not changed and would not change. But the path to it, she was beginning to see, was going to run directly through the man who sat upon it. And that was going to require something from her that was more difficult than strategy and more dangerous than patience. It was going to require her to look at him honestly, and it was going to require her to let some part of what she found there matter. She was not afraid of that. She had never been afraid of difficult things. But she was, for the first time since leaving the Wolflands, very, very awake to the full complexity of what lay ahead of her. The mountain pulsed, the stars burned cold above the garden wall. Vorra stood at her window and breathed and planned and let the wolf rest quietly beneath her skin, warm and watchful and entirely patient. The game had begun in earnest, and she intended to finish it. The weeks that followed her presentation passed in a rhythm that Vorra settled into the way water settles into a new channel, steadily, without resistance, finding the shape of the thing and moving through it. She was given access to the eastern garden and the library wing and the open corridor that ran along the inner face of the palace's southern wall, which caught the afternoon light and was often used by the lesser court members for walking and quiet conversation. She was not given access to the throne room, the council chamber, the mountain passage, or the upper towers, and nobody told her this directly. But the pattern of where guards stood and where doors were left without handles on the outer face made the boundaries perfectly clear. She respected the boundaries. She walked only where she was permitted to walk, and she was seen doing so consistently and without apparent frustration, until the guards who rotated through her section of the palace began to look at her the way people look at furniture, present and familiar, and requiring no particular attention. that was when she started learning the things she actually needed to learn. The library wing was her greatest tool in those early weeks. It was a long, low-ceilinged room with shelves of bound records and clay tablets stretching from floor to ceiling, more dusty in the way that rooms are dusty when they are maintained but not often visited, and it smelled of old bone and dry reed and the particular stillness of accumulated years. An elderly record keeper named Tobeth sat at a desk near the entrance and watched everything with eyes that were sharper than his slouched posture suggested. And Vorra had understood immediately that Tobeth was important and that winning his trust quietly would open more doors than any key. She had started by asking him simple questions about the record system, genuine questions, asked with real curiosity and without any attempt to appear more knowledgeable than she was. Tobeth had answered carefully the first time, watching her the way you watch a stranger who might be harmless or might not. The second time, he answered a little more openly. By the fourth visit, Tahi had begun to anticipate her questions and had the relevant tablets already pulled and waiting at the edge of his desk. She had learned the structure of the Emperor's territories from those records. She had learned the names of the 7 regional governors, in which 3 of them had sent fewer grain contributions than required in the last 2 harvests. She had learned the names of the old council members who had been displaced, and she had learned that 2 of them were still alive and living in the outer territories, which was interesting in a way she did not yet fully understand but filed carefully. She had also learned from a single cracked and water-damaged tablet that Tobeth had almost moved past without comment, that the great throne of the Dragon Emperor was not simply a seat of governance. It was bound in the old way, through a rite that had been performed at the founding of the empire, to a rite that tied the power of the mountain's deep fire to the body of whoever sat upon the throne, and which could only be transferred willingly through a ceremony that required the consent of the holder. Vorra had read this 3 times quietly, with her face absolutely still, and then she had moved on to the next tablet as if the information had been only mildly interesting. But inside, something had clicked into place with the clean and satisfying precision of a bone settling back into its proper joint. The throne could not be taken by force. It had to be given, which meant the path to it ran not through battle or coup, or the slow accumulation of political allies, though all of those things still mattered. It ran through the man himself. It ran through his consent. She had already known this. In the wordless way she had known it standing at her window on her first night in the palace. But knowing it with evidence, with the weight of recorded history behind it, made it real in a different and more useful way. She began spending more time in the parts of the palace where she was likely to encounter Kyle Dravos. Not in any obvious way. She did not position herself in his path or arrange to be where he was going. She simply expanded her walking routes within her permitted areas, and she was unhurried and present and easy to approach, and she let the natural movement of palace life do the rest. He found her, the first real time, in the eastern garden on a morning when the light came through the mountain's shadow at a low angle and turned everything it touched a particular shade of deep gold. She was crouched near the far wall, looking closely at one of the dark-leafed plants that grew in the garden's careful rows. And she did not hear him approach because he moved with the same quiet she had noted at the dinner, the trained, habitual quiet of someone who had learned early that silence was a tool. She was aware of him a moment before he spoke, the wolf giving her that small advance notice that human senses alone would have missed, and she used that moment to settle herself and decide how to receive him. Not with surprise, not with performance, but with simple, natural ease. He asked what she was looking at. He asked it from a few steps away, giving her room, which she noticed and registered. She told him it was a plant she did not know, one that had no equivalent in the Wolflands, and that she had been trying to understand what it needed to grow so well in soil that seemed too dry and too hot for anything this green. She said it plainly, without turning it into anything more than it was. A real observation, honestly stated. Mahi came to stand beside her and look at the plant, and he told her, after a moment, that it was called stone root in the old tongue, and that it grew by sending its roots so deep into the rock below the soil that it could reach the water table that most plants had no hope of accessing. He said it simply, the way a person shares a fact they have known for so long, it has become unremarkable to them. She looked at the plant with new attention, and she said, genuinely, that it was remarkable, that something could survive in such hard ground by going deeper than the ground expected. There was a silence after that, and she let it sit without filling it, and after a moment he made a quiet sound that was not quite a word, but that carried the weight of agreement, of something recognized. They walked back through the garden without much more conversation, and it was easy. It was unexpectedly easy. And she held on to that fact without letting it soften anything in her or blur the clarity of what she was doing. Easy did not mean safe. Easy did not mean she could stop watching, but it was useful, and it was real, and she did not pretend otherwise. Over the following weeks they crossed paths with increasing frequency, and each time the conversation went a little further, opening like the garden did in the morning, gradually and without force. He was not the man the palace treated him as. She had already known this, but she understood it more concretely now. He was contained, yes, and he was careful, and he held himself at a distance from everyone around him with the automatic efficiency of someone who had learned to do so very young and had never found a compelling reason to stop. But he was also observant in a way that matched hers, and curious in a way that had clearly had very little to feed on for a long time. And there was a quality to his attention when he spoke with her that was different from the quality she had seen him give to anyone else in the great hall. It was less managed. It was more present. She noticed this. She noticed it, and she thought about it carefully, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that it was not entirely a tool. Some part of what she felt in those moments was simply the recognition of a mind that worked in a way that was not entirely unlike her own, and that was not something she had encountered often, not in the Wolflands, not anywhere. She did not let this move her from her course, but she did not lie to herself about it either, because lying to herself had always seemed like the most wasteful kind of dishonesty, the kind that only ever hurt the person doing it. One evening, near the end of her 6th week in the palace, Kyle Dravos came to the eastern garden after dark, alone, without guards, which was unusual enough that she had straightened slightly when she sensed him coming. He stood near the stone root plant and looked at it for a moment, and then he said, without preamble, that he knew she was not simply waiting. Vorra looked at him. She did not pretend to misunderstand him. She asked quietly what he thought she was doing. He said he did not know exactly. He said he had been watching her long enough to know that she was building something, learning something, or accumulating something, though he had not been able to determine what, and that this was both interesting and worth naming aloud. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, carefully and without lying, that she had been sent here with one purpose, and that she had always intended to find her own. She said it looking directly at him, the way she looked at important things, with open, clear attention. He was quiet for a long time. The mountain pulsed beneath them, low and steady. The stars were thick above the garden wall. And then he said, in a voice that was not angry and not cold, but that carried something she could not yet fully name, that he respected that. Just that. He respected that. She looked at him and felt the shape of the thread she had been tracing all these weeks, clearer now than it had ever been, running directly between them, exactly where she had known it would be. And she felt, alongside all of her clarity and all of her purpose, something else. Something that was warmer and more complicated and more honest than strategy, pressing quietly against the inside of her chest. She breathed through it. She kept her face steady. She said goodnight, and she walked back through the garden to her rooms, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and let the wolf breathe slowly around the feeling until it settled into something she could carry without losing her footing. The path was clear. It had always been clear. But it was going to cost her something real to walk it, something she had not fully accounted for when she made her promise in the dark of the wolflands with cold earth beneath her feet and the double moon long past and only the fire in her bones to guide her. She had known walking into this palace that she might have to give things to get what she came for. She had been prepared for that. She had calculated it and accepted it. She had not calculated for the possibility that some of what she gave might be real. The mountain spoke before the end of her 3rd month in the palace. It did not speak in words. It spoke the way deep things always speak, through feeling, through a change in pressure that moved up through the stone floors and into the soles of Vorra's feet, while she stood at her window in the early hours of a still morning and told her, with the wordless certainty of a wolf-born sense, that something below was shifting. By the time the rest of the palace felt it, she had already been awake for 2 hours, sitting with it, measuring it, turning it over in her mind. The tremor that finally reached the upper levels was small, barely enough to rattle the clay dishes on her table, but the servants who ran through the corridor outside her door in its aftermath were not behaving as people behave when something small has happened. They were behaving as people behave when something small has happened that they know is the first sign of something much larger. Vorra dressed quickly. She moved through the corridor with the measured pace she always used in the palace, unhurried, present, giving the impression of someone who was simply going about her morning and had happened to be awake. She moved toward the sound of the most concentrated movement and noise, because that was always where the most useful information was, and she listened as she walked, collecting fragments of speech from the rushing servants the way she collected everything. Be with patience, and without waste. She learned that the lower mountain chamber had been filling with heat for several days. She learned that the 3 firekeepers whose responsibility it was to monitor the deep vents had sent word to the High Council 2 days ago, and that the council had deliberated and decided the situation was manageable. She learned that the Emperor had been told and had gone to inspect the lower chamber himself, alone, the previous night, and that he had not yet returned. This last piece stopped her. She stood very still in the middle of the corridor, with servants flowing past her on both sides, and held the information in her mind for exactly 3 breaths. Then she turned and walked, with purpose and without asking anyone's permission, toward the mountain passage entrance, which was in the section of the palace she was not permitted to enter, past the door without an outer handle, which she had spent 3 months learning would be left briefly unlatched during shift changes of the guards, specifically in the early morning hours when the night rotation had finished and the day rotation had not yet fully assembled. The door was unlatched. She went through it without breaking her stride. The mountain passage was carved directly into the rock, wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, lit by fire vessels set into the walls at long intervals, and it descended in a steady slope that she could feel in her legs and her ears, the way you feel descent in deep places as a change in pressure, a thickening of the air, a warmth that built gradually from ambient to notable to significant. The wolf in her was not happy. The heat was wrong for her kind, too dry and too ancient, nothing like the heat of a running body or a sun-warmed clearing. It was the heat of something that had never had a name for cold, and it pressed against her senses with a kind of alien weight that required real effort to move through without retreating. She moved through it anyway, because retreating was not something she was practicing. She found him at the base of the passage, in the great lower chamber, which opened out from the end of the tunnel like a held breath released, vast and dark and lit from below by the deep fire that moved through the fissures in the chamber floor in long, slow rivers of light. The heat here was tremendous. It pressed against her skin and her lungs with serious weight, and she stood in the mouth of the passage for a moment, breathing carefully, letting her body negotiate with the temperature before she moved further. Kyle Dravos was standing at the edge of the central fissure, looking down into the fire below, and he was not fully himself. She could see it from where she stood. His form was shifting at the edges, the way the air shifts above hot stone, and the outline of him flickering and blurring. And she understood that he was in the part of his nature that lived between his human form and what lay beneath it, and that he had been there for long enough that the return was not coming easily. His hands, held slightly out from his sides, were trailing long ribbons of heat that moved through the air like the fins of a deep-water creature, graceful and involuntary and entirely beyond his control. He had heard her come in. He had turned his head slightly at the sound, though he had not turned his body, and she could see the line of tension through his back and shoulders, the effort of a man holding a great deal in place through will alone. She did not approach him in a rush. She walked forward slowly and steadily, the way she walked toward frightened animals, with her weight soft and her presence open and no sudden movements. And she spoke his name once, clearly and without alarm. The way you speak to someone who needs to hear a familiar voice more than they need to hear anything useful. He said through the flickering and the heat that she should not be here, that this place was not safe for her, that she needed to leave. He said it with effort, each word carrying the weight of the control he was simultaneously trying to apply to a body that was not currently interested in being controlled. She told him she was not leaving. She said it simply, without argument, as a statement of fact. He made a sound that was half warning and half something rawer than warning, and the heat in the room climbed noticeably, and one of the fire ribbons from his hands grew larger and moved faster, and she felt the wolf rise sharply in response, not in aggression, but in the instinctive alertness of a creature facing something that outmatched it in pure, elemental force. She breathed the wolf back down. She did not rush it, and she did not fight it. She simply held it the way she had always held it, through will and breath and the deep practice of years, and she kept walking forward until she was close enough that the heat coming off him was a physical pressure against her face. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He went rigid, The fire ribbons snapped and shortened. The flickering at his edges stuttered and slowed, and she held her hand where it was, steady and present and entirely certain, to pouring through the touch, not command, but something older and simpler than command. The same thing she gave the frightened horse on the journey here. The same thing she gave the wolf in herself when it was restless and needed anchoring. Presence, warmth, the steady signal of something alive and unafraid and right here with you. The shift pulled back. Not all at once, not smoothly, but in stages, the way a tide recedes, each wave pulling back a little further than the last, until the flickering at his edges stopped entirely and the heat in the room dropped back to something manageable, and he was standing in his full human form with her hand on his arm and his breathing rough and slow in the enormous quiet of the mountain chamber. He did not speak for a long time. She did not push him. She stood beside him and looked down into the fisher's slow river of fire with him, the two of them side by side in the deep mountain heat. And she let the silence be what it needed to be, which was large and real and full of things that did not need to be rushed into words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and stripped of its usual careful management, and he said that no one had ever come down here. Not once in 12 years of this. Not a guard, not a council member, not any person who knew what happened in this chamber. He said it without self-pity, with the flat simplicity of a man stating a fact that had lived so long inside him, it had calcified there. She said that she knew. She said that she had figured it was a long time to carry something that heavy without anyone standing beside you while you carried it. He turned to look at her then, fully, the way he had not quite turned to look at anyone in the palace, in all the time she had been watching him. And his amber eyes in the deep firelight were not the eyes of an emperor managing a room or a man holding himself precisely in place. They were simply eyes, present and unguarded, and carrying something that had clearly been waiting a very long time for somewhere to land. She looked back at him. She did not look away, and she did not manage her expression, and she did not calculate the effect of what she was giving him in that moment, because some things could not be weaponized without destroying the only quality that made them useful. This was one of them. Something passed between them in that moment, in the great lit dark of the mountain's belly, with the fire moving slowly and ancient below them and the palace a world away above. Something that did not have a clean name in any language she knew, but that settled into her chest with the weight and warmth of something true. She let it settle. She did not run from it. But she did not forget, not for a single breath, what she had come here to do. The truth of the feeling and the truth of the purpose lived side by side inside her without cancelling each other. Because she was not the kind of woman who needed things to be simple in order to act clearly. She would take this throne. She would take it for her people and for every woman sold like goods on a cold night by a father who did not truly see her, and she would hold it in the way it needed to be held. But she was beginning to understand, down here in the mountain's fire-lit dark, that taking it might not look the way she had originally imagined. It might not look like conquest at all. It might look like something much older and much stranger and much more powerful than that. It might look like being chosen. The morning after the mountain chamber, everything in the palace felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, not changed in any way that the court could point to and name. The corridors looked the same, the servants moved the same. The great hall sat at the centre of the palace the same way it always had, solid and enormous, and hung with the banners of conquered peoples. But something beneath all of it had shifted, the way the ground shifted after a deep tremor, not visibly, not with any crack or collapse, but fundamentally in the layer below what the eye could see. Vorra felt it the moment she woke, and she lay still for a moment in her bed, breathing slowly, letting her senses move through the palace the way she let them move through any territory she was learning, outward and careful and without assumption. What she felt was not danger. What she felt was opening. She rose and dressed and went to the library, not because she needed more records. She had everything she needed from the records, but because Tobeth was there, and Tobeth had been in this palace for 40 years, and there were things he knew that no tablet held, things stored in the quiet, precise memory of a man who had watched everything and been overlooked for most of his life, and had therefore seen a great deal more than anyone had ever given him credit for. She sat across from him, and she did not approach what she needed sideways or through pretense, because Tobeth was too sharp for that, and she had too much respect for sharpness to insult it. She told him directly that she needed to understand the full right, the binding right, the one that tied the throne's power to its holder, and she needed to understand whether it had ever, in the history of the records, been transferred while the holder still lived. Tobeth looked at her for a long, still moment. His sharp, old eyes moved over her face with the attention of a man reading something in a language he knows very well but does not see written often. And then he got up from his desk without a word and went to the far end of the library where the oldest tablets were stored, and came back with 3 that she had not seen before, set them carefully on the table in front of her, and sat back down. He said only this. He said that she should read the 3rd one last, and that when she had finished, and she should think carefully before deciding what she intended to do, because the rite was not simply a ceremony, it was a covenant, and covenants bound both parties equally, without preference for who had more power at the start. She read all 3. She read them slowly and with total attention, the way she read anything that mattered, and when she finished the 3rd one, she sat with it in silence for a long time, and Tobeth sat across from her and waited without fidgeting, on the way very old and very patient people wait. The rite required the throne's holder to speak the transfer aloud in the old imperial tongue, in the presence of the council and the fire. But it also required one more thing, a thing that the official histories had glossed over in a single line, and that the 3rd tablet, older and less edited, described in full. The person receiving the throne had to have already proven, through action and not through claim, that they could hold what the mountain held, that they could stand in the deep fire and not be consumed, that they were not simply taking power but were capable of carrying it. Vorra thought about the mountain chamber. She thought about the heat pressing against her face and the wolf rising sharp inside her, and the way she had breathed it all back down and walked forward anyway, and placed her hand on his arm and held steady while everything around her was burning. She had already passed the test. She had passed it without knowing it was a test, which was, she thought, the only way a real test could ever be passed. She thanked Tobeth. She rose and walked out of the library, and she went to find Kyle Dravos. She found him in the throne room. She had never been inside it before. The doors were open, which was unusual, and the guards who stood at either side of the entrance looked at her with the careful, uncertain expression of men who had been given standing orders about this woman, but were now looking at a situation those orders had not anticipated. She walked past them without giving them the opportunity to decide. moving through the doors with the same unhurried certainty she had used in every corridor of this palace for 3 months. The throne room was tall and narrow and entirely different from the Great Hall. Where the Great Hall was built for spectacle and display, the throne room was built for weight. The walls were bare black stone, undecorated, and the ceiling was vaulted and dark above, and the floor was the same polished black as the rest of the palace, but somehow more so here, more deliberate, as if the reflective quality of the stone was part of the room's purpose, to show you yourself as you approached the throne, to make you look at what you were bringing with you. The throne itself was at the far end, raised on 3 steps of dark stone, and it was not what she had imagined. It was not enormous or gilded or hung with the trappings of power. It was spare and old and made of a stone she did not recognize, dark but not black, with a quality to it that she could only describe as alive, the same way the mountain was alive, holding heat and memory and something older than either. Kyle Dravos stood beside it, not seated on it, standing beside it with one hand resting on its arm, and he looked at her when she entered without surprise, as if he had known she was coming, which perhaps, with whatever senses his nature gave him, he had. She walked the length of the room toward him, and she did not hurry and she did not slow, and when she reached the steps she stopped and looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him from the first night, with open and honest attention and nothing hidden in it. He said her name. Just her name, Vorra, in the quiet of the throne room. And the way he said it carried everything that had been building between them since the garden, and the stone root plant, and the mountain chamber, and all the mornings and evenings in between. The weight of a man who had been alone in the fullest sense of the word for a very long time, and who had, without planning it or wanting to need it, stopped being alone somewhere along the way. She said to him that she needed to tell him the truth. She said it clearly, and she watched his face, and she told him everything. She told him that she had come to this palace with a purpose that was her own and not her father's, that she had spent 3 months learning the palace and its structure and its history and the shape of his power and the thread within it that she had intended to pull when the time was right. She told him about the records and the binding rite and what the 3rd tablet said. She told him about the promise she had made to herself in the dark of the wolflands with cold earth beneath her feet, the promise to take his throne, to hold it in the way it needed to be held, for her people and for every woman traded away in the night by a man who did not see her value. She told him all of it. She did not soften it, and she did not apologize for it, and she did not dress it in anything other than what it was. He listened. He stood with his hand on the arm of the throne and he listened to all of it, and his face moved through several things that were real and unmanaged and entirely different from the face he wore in the Great Hall. She watched them move through him, and she let them, without trying to control or redirect what he was feeling, because he deserved to feel it honestly, and because anything less than that would have made everything she had just said into a performance, which it was not. When she finished, the throne room was very quiet. The pulse of the mountain moved through the floor beneath them, slow and deep and steady as it always was. The heartbeat of something that had been here before either of them and would be here long after. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, in a voice that was low and stripped of every layer except the truest one, that he had known from the night of the presentation dinner that she was not what she had been sent as. He said he had known it from the way she walked and the way she looked at him and the way her sentences carried no excess weight and her silences carried more than most people's words. He said he had spent 3 months waiting to see what she was building and telling himself it did not matter, that he would simply watch and respond when the time came, the way he responded to everything, from a safe and managed distance. He said the mountain chamber had ended that. He said that when she put her hand on his arm in the deep firelit dark and stood steady beside him and did not flinch and did not perform and did not run, something in him had decided something, quietly and completely, and without asking his permission. He stepped back from the throne. He turned to face it and then he turned back to face her. And he said that the throne had been heavy for 12 years, and that he had carried it alone for 12 years, and that alone was the worst way to carry anything heavy. He said her name again. And then he said in the old imperial tongue the words of the transfer rite, slowly and clearly, and with the full weight of a man who had thought carefully, before speaking and intended every syllable. The stone of the throne changed when he spoke. It shifted in colour, deepening for a moment into something so dark it was almost invisible, and then warming, slowly, through layers of amber and deep red and the particular orange of deep fire. And the pulse of the mountain rose through the floor and through Vorra's feet and up through her body in a wave that was unlike anything she had felt before, vast and ancient and warm in the way that only things that have existed for a very long time can be warm. The warmth of something that has survived everything and is still burning. The wolf rose in her with it, not in fear and not in aggression, but in recognition, the way two ancient things recognize each other when they finally meet. And she let it rise fully, the full shift rolling through her and back, a single complete breath of her truest nature, and the mountain's fire answered it. The deep pulse quickening for just a moment before settling back into its rhythm, deeper now, more resonant. I changed in the way that things change when a new element has been added to them that was always supposed to be there. She stepped up to the throne. She sat in it. The stone was warm beneath her, and it settled around her presence the way the stone root plant's roots settled into deep rock, finding the water table that nothing else could reach, going deeper than the ground expected, holding on in the hardest soil, with total and quiet certainty. As she looked out across the empty throne room from the height of the 3 steps, and she breathed slowly and let the full weight of what she was now holding settle into her without rushing it or shrinking from it. She thought about her father. She thought about him standing in his smoky lodge on a cold night, unrolling a scroll with an emperor's black wax seal, and nodding without looking at his daughter, trading what he did not understand for the peace he needed. She did not hate him for it. Not anymore. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It had become something colder and more useful than hatred, something that would serve her better in what was coming. She would send word to the wolf lands. She would send it in her own name, not the emperor's. And she would make it clear that the terms of the agreement had changed, that the wolf territories were not a client state of the empire, they were a partner, and that the woman Halvus had given away had not stayed given. She thought about the displaced council members living in the outer territories, and the regional governors who had withheld grain, and the servants who moved through the palace corridors with their eyes down and their steps carefully contained, and the many peoples whose skins and banners hung in the great hall as trophies. There was a great deal of work to be done, a great deal of weight to be redistributed, a great deal of old structure to be examined, and where necessary dismantled and rebuilt in a shape that could actually hold the people living inside it. It would not be simple, and it would not be fast, and it would not be without resistance, because power that has sat in one shape for a long time does not enjoy being reshaped. It fights back. It finds ways to persist. And she would need to be smarter and more patient and more relentless than all of it. She was. She had always been. She had been practicing for this her entire life without knowing the name of what she was practicing for. Kyle Dravos came to stand beside the throne, not behind it, beside it, and he looked at her with the open and unmanaged expression of a man who had just done the most honest thing he had done in 12 years and was still deciding how that felt. She looked back at him with the same honesty, and between them was the understanding of two people who had both been alone in different ways for a very long time and had found in each other something worth the difficulty of staying present for. She reached out and placed her hand over his, the same hand she had placed on his arm in the mountain chamber, steady and warm and certain. Outside the throne room, the palace moved in its daily rhythm, unaware. The great hall hung with its banners. The library held its records. The eastern garden grew its stone root plants with their deep, determined roots. The mountain pulsed beneath everything, low and steady and ancient, as it always had. But the throne had changed hands. And the woman sitting in it was not the woman anyone had sent for, traded for, or planned for. She was the woman who had walked into the palace of absolute and permanent dominion with cold earth still on her feet and fire in her bones and a promise in her chest that she had never once stopped intending to keep. Her father had given her away on a cold night without looking her in the eyes. He had thought he was being clever. He had thought he was making the kind of hard decision that great leaders make. He had not thought about what his daughter would do once she arrived. He should have. Vorra, last daughter of the double moon, wolf-born and fire-proven, sat upon the throne of the dragon emperor and breathed slowly and let the mountain's ancient warmth move through the stone beneath her, and the wolf rested easy in her chest. And she began. If this story moved you, if it kept you watching, if Vorra's journey felt like something you needed to see through, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Your location, your name, your corner of this wide world. Let us know you are here. Let us know this fire reached you.